Hello, everyone. It is MJ. If you don't know who I am, I used to play World of Tanks Blitz competitively for a long time, and I started playing this game back in 2014 when it first came out. Took a little bit of a break in 2017, came back to the game, and have basically been playing it ever since. I played for the comp team Joker when it first came up and coming, played for Origin, Leverage, a lot of notable NA teams, right? So I would say that overall I am pretty knowledgeable on this game, and I do know what I'm talking about. So without further ado, we're going to get into ranking TDs at tier 10, all right? I'm only going to be ranking TDs. I could rank all the classes of tank in tier 10 at once. However, I find that doesn't really give you a nuanced approach as to how tanks stack up against each other, because then you're ranking heavies against lights, lights against meds, and it doesn't really give you a pretty good approach as to what are the best tanks for each class. All right. But without further ado, we're going to get started. We're going to talk about the 183. 183, I wouldn't say it's why play this. Obviously, there's a reason to play this tank. It's for the nuking capability, but ultimately it just comes down to that it's mid and situational. Now, I know some people may be saying nowadays it's strong just due to refined being the meta for equipment choices. However, ultimately this tank is just doesn't have the speed, the armor, and overall it just has a very long reload, so you are still able to punish it quite effectively. But yes, it does nuke, and it does nuke consistently. I just don't think it's pushing it into a strong category. You're still going to lose a decent bit with this tank, right? 4005. 4005, like, I know there's people out there right now saying that this thing is, like, overpowered. It's, like, a powerhouse, like, it's super toxic. Yes, I will say it's super toxic. I just don't think it's in the overpowered category, right? I think it's probably super competitive when it comes to TDs. It's just not as flexible as a lot may think it is. At one point, when this thing had 460 alpha times 3 in the clip, and it had around 3,500 DPM and like 20 reverse speed, I would say this thing was pretty flexible and approaching overpowered. Unfortunately, community just didn't see that. Right now, it's just kind of a very campy vehicle, right? You can like frontline with this thing, but ultimately, if you do frontline with this thing and you do go for pokes, you're going to rely on the super speed boost as a crutch to get you out of certain situations and while reversing, right? So ultimately, super competitive. I don't think it's in the overpowered category. Like, I wouldn't say, like, this thing ultimately it does nuke less than when it did with 4 shots in the clip. So I don't think it's as toxic. But just a lot of people are annoyed with this tank, in all honesty. But Badger, I will say the Badger, it has gotten better over the years. I would say that it's still a little too inaccurate for my taste. I just don't think it feels that good to play. Like, there are situations, hence the situational ranking, that this thing feels kind of overpowered. But ultimately, they nerfed the traverse back from when it was like 50 to 45 degrees of traverse a second. So, like, I would say that was probably its best moment to shine. However, nowadays, it still just gets abused by, like, mediums, by lights. And on top of it, there's so many tanks running high pen heat rounds nowadays that a lot of these tanks that you're going against, especially like heavies and other TDs, they're just going to YOLO pen the front of this thing unless you're like fully hold down using 10 degrees to gun depression on a ridgeline. You're just not going to get the results that you want. So yeah, definitely mid. Foch. Foch, I would say, is strong. It is definitely more flexible than something like a Badger and a 183. However, ultimately, this thing just sucks when it comes to gun accuracy. It has 2 gun options. It's got the single shot gun, and then it's got the 2-shot gun. I recommend the 2-shot gun. It's overall more accurate, and you're able to just pump out a lot more damage in a short amount of time. My big issue with this thing is it has very limited gun arc, so you're constantly moving the vehicle when you're aiming for shots, like or tanks that are moving. And it just has horrible bloom factors and on the move factors, right? So this gun is constantly blooming whenever you're having to aim. And for that reason, it just feels like you're kind of just shooting a shotgun at like 200 meters, hoping to hit something, right? So ultimately, yes, it has tungsten. Yes, you're able to nuke on a comparable level to the 4005. However, I will say 4005, while not being the most flexible TD at the tier, is definitely more flexible than the Foch, right? Grill, this one, I'm going to get a lot of hate. I think this thing is the most toxic tank in the game, or toxic TD in the game right now. It is just so flexible right now. It is insane. All right. For those who were around for 60 km/h grill when it was first released back in like 2017, you'll understand that this thing is like so fast now. It is so nimble. The gun arc is absolutely insane. You basically can just do very safe pokes now, where you can just back up, aim over the side, fire, and then just go quickly into cover. It has gear oil. There's basically no downside to this thing now. You also get SPAL, so you're not getting nuked that much by HE. You have 3600 DPM if you're running Rammer, and even if you were to run Kali, let's take a look here. With Kali, it should be around 3500 to 3400, right? Yeah, if you run Kali, you're down to 3400. Ooh, big whoop, right? This thing is just so accurate at any distance. It's insane. And if you think it's still not accurate enough, run reticle calibration, and you're going to hit anyways, right? There's just really, realistically, no downside to this thing other than the fact that it's lightly armored. And yes, if you're a 50%er or a 40%er, you're going to struggle into this thing. But for the majority of your good players, they're going to abuse this thing like no other, right? Minotauro. Now, I know a lot of people hate this tank just because it's boring to play. And yes, while I admit that it is boring to play, it is honestly just, it just wins, right? It is one of the highest win rate tanks by relative win rate, I think, beat out by just the mouse, right? And that ultimately just comes down to the thing is stupidly armored for what it is, even in a meta where Kali is the meta and a lot of tanks can just butter the turret easily. If you get this thing on a ridgeline, it's still going to bounce a lot. Ultimately it has a nasty clip, right? I can't tell you the amount of times where I'll just dump the entire clip because I know the dude is going to be down 15 to 1600 HP by the end of it, and he's basically just completely neutered for the rest of the game, right? And for that reason, I do think it's just overall a more enjoyable and better experience when it comes to winning and actually like pushing for game wins than the 4005. 4005 is just kind of crutched at the fact that it's just too big. Yes, it's flexible, but like you're not realistically going to win nearly as much as a Minotauro, right? Yag, why play this thing in the current state that it is, right? It is essentially just a worse 183. And now I know like people are like, oh, like it has armor, it's not a 183. Sure, bud. But ultimately, it's a high alpha, right? It's a high alpha TD that's meant for nuking, and it just does a worse job at it than the 183, right? Yes, it has armor, but the armor is super predictable. It's super easy to avoid this tank. It used to have 15 seconds of reload, which made it like super enjoyable, and it used to be like way more accurate. But right now, it's barely accurate. To say that this thing is accurate is just a complete and utter lie. And it has a 16.6 second reload with Rammer, right? And that is honestly just as comparable to the 183, and the 183 is nuking for more and just has better accuracy in general, right? So overall, like I just there's no real reason to play this thing when there's so many other tanks that can nuke for more with a clip, or just are just better off armor wise, right? NC70, I'm gonna be honest, this is another one that's kind of a nothing burger. I will say you're probably going to enjoy this thing more than the Yag. However, this thing doesn't go much further than that, right? And ultimately, it just comes down to the fact that this thing wants to be an assault TD, but it just does a horrible job at it, right? A lot of your other assault TDs, I would say tanks like your Foch, your 113 GFT, they just do a better job at being a frontline brawler and being able to put out damage than this. Yes, the Blisk does have the added capability of like the closer you are to the enemy, the more damage you're going to do. And in that 15 or 50 meter sweet spot range, you are like consistently rolling 700, 800 damage, and it does like just you're just going to out DPM everything at that distance. The issue is you don't start at that distance in the battle, right? So ultimately you have to close the distance somehow, and you're probably getting penned 1 to 2 times by like a heavy, a medium while you're closing that distance, and it's just not fast enough to close that distance in any meaningful way, and it doesn't have the armor or a large enough HP pool to make up for it, right? If this thing had like 2100, 2200 HP like in E4, I could definitely see this thing jumping up in the list. However, at distance, you're just kind of hitting things for 400 damage. You don't have enough HP to leverage, trading at that short distance. So ultimately, it just kind of falls off a lot when compared to these other tanks. 263. This is a tank that basically does what the Blisk does, but better, right? It's supposed to out DPM things, but it can do it at any distance, right? And that is the major advantage that this thing has, right? Ultimately, I would say that I probably enjoy this thing over the Foch, because yes, it still has terrible bloom statistics. However, the bloom statistics are alleviated by the fact that this thing's gun arc was buffed massively, right? You're able to side scrape a lot more effectively now. You still have great DPM. You will just out DPM everything that you come across. 460 alpha with as an AP round, because they got rid of APCR for this thing. Just overall feels a lot better. Main drawback, lower plate, and then the bar right above the superstructure is pennable. But that being said, you're still able to face hug very effectively. You're able to pen basically everything that you come across. Just overall, I will say this thing is more enjoyable than the Foch. 268, ultimately this thing just lands again in super competitive. I don't think it's nuking just as much as a 4005, but I do think it is more flexible than a 4005. Ultimately, this thing just is invisible to the naked eye. This thing could be sitting in the open, and you're probably not going to spot it. With the buff to camo net values for TDs, which will get nerfed next update, just keep in mind, this thing is the most camo TD at tier 10, right? And ultimately, it has 670 alpha, decent gun handling, decent alpha at 670, decent pen overall, 380 millimeters of heat pen. You're just not going to struggle with this thing, and on top of it, it's very mobile, right? So there's really nothing that this thing can't do, and it has the occasional bounce here and there, but overall, just it's good is what it is, you know? Ho-Ri, this is a tank that is definitely going into overpowered. Would I put it over the Grill? Probably. This thing is the definition of just brain dead, right? You have reactive still from the reactive days. A lot of tanks got lost reactive at tier 10. This is one of the tanks that remains with reactive. You basically lose no damage when you switch from your standard shell to your premium shell, and for that reason you kind of just make a jump in pen for basically no downside at all, right? This kind of feels like a Watt PC tank in that sense, where you basically lose nothing for loading the gold, and 380 millimeters of AP pen is absolutely absurd, right? You basically turn the entire front of the minnow completely gray when you're using this tank, and on top of it, if you're using reactive and people are shooting heat at you, just because standard is kind of wishy-washy in terms of penning the front of a Ho-Ri, they're loading heat, they're losing out on alpha, you're using reactive, they're losing out on even more alpha, and then on top of that, you're using premium AP and basically just hitting for just as much as your standard, right? It's just a dumb tank all in all, right? No arguments there. Version 4, I would say this thing has fallen off with the Kali meta just because a lot of tanks will just YOLO pen it. However, I still think this thing is overall pretty strong. I think this thing is a better 263 just because, yes, it doesn't have the DPM as the 263. It may not be like a YOLO wagon like the 263 or the Foch. However, you do have 670 alpha, decent enough gun stats to hit shots reliably. And if you just go for like corner pokes and just nuke, this thing does a pretty good job, right, over something like the 268. But ultimately, it's just not as flexible as something like a Minnow, a 268, or a 4005, and that's where it loses out, right? Ultimately, like, You're going to get tracked. You're going to get Cupola sniped, right? And it just doesn't have the gun stats to like snap. And for that reason, you do have to aim in a bit, and that gives time for the enemy to aim in on you, right? This is another tank that has reactive, right? So toxic in that sense. But other than that, it really just doesn't compete with something like a Ho-Ri, where the Ho-Ri is just going to butter a V4 all day, every day. E3, ultimately, I do think this thing is still super competitive. Now, a lot of people think this thing has fallen off, and yes, it has, in terms of the fact that Calibrated has been buffed. This thing does get penned a lot more reliably frontally, especially near the driver's port and the cupola, but ultimately, it is what it is. It's a 2000 HP, super heavy as a TD with 680 alpha and a very high pen APCR premium round. And for that reason, I still think it is super competitive. It is one of the higher TD. It is one of the TDs with higher relative win rate. Although not as much as the Minnow, it is still higher for most TDs, right? For the E4, I do think in terms of if you are a good player, you're going to get more value out of this thing than, like, let's say a 4005 and an E3, and that ultimately just comes down to the fact that you have 2200 HP, right? This thing, if you're looking for something to compare it to, if you any of you old timers remember the 2300 HP E100 with a 14.5 second reload, this is the comparable version to that, but you just have more DPM. And for that reason, you're able to trade a lot more effectively. You're able to just go into heavy brawls and just out-trade heavies, which is kind of insane, right? And for that reason, the E4, I feel you are going to farm more and you are going to win more compared to something like an E3, a 268, and a 4005, just because you have that HP to leverage and you do have a very good gun, right? The Waffen is a why play this? This thing sucks complete ass, all right? This thing is probably the worst tank in the game, other than probably the BZT. This thing is basically what the 4005 is, but worse in every way. It doesn't have SPAL. The reload is way too long for what it is. If they want to make this thing competitive, you either make it a 2-shot with the high alpha gun, or you make it a 3-shot with semi-high alpha, right? Honestly, if they made this thing like 500 or 460 alpha with 3 shots in the clip and just a way better reload, you would see me using this thing a lot more. Ultimately, it's just a fun vehicle. It's not really a good vehicle. China Box, or the 113 GFT, this thing still goes into super competitive. Yes, it has been nerfed since its days of just having crazy traverse speed and having reactive, but ultimately it is what it is. It's honestly a better E3 in most circumstances. Yes, the armor may not be as strong, however, it is more mobile, and it does have 650 alpha, and it is able to just, dominate a ridge line. It is able to bounce. It is able to brawl in like town situations where the E3 may not be as good, right? And it doesn't have the track wheel weak spot like the E3. And for that reason, it definitely deserves super competitive. It does compete with the rest of these tanks. I think it's as versatile as like a 268. Probably not. Yeah, sure. Like one could make the argument that the China Box has more armor than the 268, but the 268 just has more gun depression. It's a lot more sneaky. It's a lot more mobile, and your gun is arguably just overall better than the China Box. XM66F. This is basically if a E4 and a Badger had a child. This is what the Badger tries to do, but ultimately fails. And the reason for that is the XM is just overall more versatile, right? It has a turret, although can't spin the entire way. It has a turret. You can handle a lot of situations. Due to that, it has 20 reverse speed, which is insane for an E4 or a American TD or just American tanks in general. And then on top of that, it has 3600 DPM, and as a result, you get something that is able to kind of just dominate a ridgeline against other heavies, right? Now, granted, the armor isn't amazing. You are going to get like heat pen through the mantlet and through the vision port located to the right of the gun, like decently amount. However, you're just going to out DPM things before they have the chance, and your accuracy is also good enough to where you can be Capolo sniping heavies on a ridge line while you're also on the ridge line, right? So overall, good tank. Do I think it moves much higher? Do I think it goes into super competitive? Probably not. It kind of just gets out traded with a lot of these other tanks, and these other tanks are just way more flexible compared to the XM, right? But overall, guys, that is my tier list for TDs at tier 10. If you guys got any questions, comments, concerns when it comes to this tier list or like future videos, by all means, be sure to comment. But that being said, if you guys think that any of these tanks need to be placed elsewhere, by all means, let me know. I love hearing your guys' opinions. But without further ado, have a wonderful rest of your day.